Hello and welcome to Introduction to Sufism. Thank you for taking time out of your lives to join us today. Uh, we have what we have on offer for today's class is an absolutely exquisite film called Baba Aziz, which we'll be watching. And this operates as something as a culmination of all of the other discussions that we've had this semester about visual arts, saints, the Sufi path, poetry, music, will all be coming together in this film. In fact, I would argue that this film is the most exquisite exploration of Sufi philosophy ever on film. And so it's a really, really extraordinary film, and a little bit difficult to get your hands on, which is why we'll be watching it together today. If you are interested in seeing the film yourself, you will notice that as soon as I finish the intro, that I have to pause the video because I cannot actually record the film from another website. I will be streaming it live for anyone who's here for the live portion. But for those of you who would like to watch the film, it is available in a couple of different formats on YouTube. One of them is chopped into 6 pieces, each about 13 to 15 minutes long. Another version on YouTube is just available in the Farsi and Arabic itself with no subtitles. So it is available. It's just a little bit difficult to get with English subtitles, which is what we're going to be watching with today. So if you would like to join us in watching the film, when I stop the video, please go check it out at that point, and we will be returning at the end of the film for a short discussion and wrap up. After which, I will be breaking out with the students to discuss papers and assignments and what have you, and we'll take it from there. Well, so let me introduce you to this wonderful, wonderful movie called Bab Aziz. Now, Aziz means the great, and Bab technically could mean door. Um, so it could be the passage or the path of the great door is possible one understanding, but also you'll see the apostrophe there in the title of the film. It means that there's another vowel. If you were writing it in Arabic, you would know that, and so it's Baba Aziz, but it's a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to those of us that come from these Islamic hate cultures. Um, so just as a first note, we have here a statement by the director, Nasser Khamir, who's a Tunisian director, and he had the following to say. One could also say that Sufism is the pulsating heart of Islam. Far from being a marginal phenomena, it is the esoteric dimension of the Islamic message. Abu Hassan al-Nuri, a great Sufi, once said, Sufism is the renouncement of all selfish pleasures, because true love cannot be selfish. He also said, a true Sufi has no possessions, and he himself is possessed by nothing. That's also a quote from Imam Ali. Love has many shapes in the movie. The example of Ishtar, the little girl who is brought out from the sand, like the Arabic language, is reminiscent of the letter vowel, which looks like a reverse E, kind of. Which in Arabic means and can mean many things, actually. The Sufis call it the letter of love because without it, nothing can come together. We say the sea and the sky, man and woman. The vow is a meeting place that is the place of love. It is also the letter of the traveler because it gathers together things and beings. The other person involved in the making of this film and a co-writer is Tonino Guerra. For those of you who may not know him, he is a very important voice. He's a poet, a Marxist and atheist poet, actually, who is also involved in a lot of very famous directors' projects throughout the 70s and 80s. I could just rattle off famous filmmakers' names such as Antonioni, Fellini, others, and he has worked sort of with all of them. And so it's kind of interesting that he's here and present in this film. And this film was financed by the French government, the Swiss government, Tunisians, and the Irani government, I believe, as well. And they all came together to sort of create this love letter to Sufism, which is why the film is sort of so lush and so beautiful, because one of the themes that's important for us also when we are studying Sufism is the concept of beauty itself. As I have mentioned in previous classes, the study of beauty, the encounter and engagement of beauty is one of the ways that Sufis understand that you can engage in meditative acts to encounter God. What you're going to be watching in the film now, this is a little bit unusual, but if I was just to show the film without any of the build-up that I'm about to do, it wouldn't make sense. What I'm going to give you is a little bit of a template for how to watch this movie because it is very loaded, and when we're checking it out, it with this foreknowledge, you'll see it'll deepen and enrich in your approach to the film itself. The first thing that's important in Sufism, and we have discussed this in previous classes, is this notion of the journey. And going on a journey, leaving the places which you are familiar and which you call home, and going abroad and away from those things to encounter the world. We see this taking place for a number of Sufi figures. Halaj travels, Ibn Arabi travels, and you've got many famous accounts of travelers coming from later as well, such as Ibn Battuta and others. So travel in this sense can also be divided into two forms. So first is the physical act of actually going, being a stranger in a strange land. And the second, pardon me, is to engage on the spiritual path or to take the tariq or tariqa, the a different route, a different road for God, and then commit yourself to that path as well. And as we've seen during over the course of the semester, sometimes that means taking a master, sometimes that means relating to the Quran in an esoteric way, seeking a mystical experience of God. These are all under this kind of umbrella concept here. In addition, it flows from a hadith which is quoted here: "Whomsoever knows himself knows his Lord," and the word himself here is nafsahu. So it comes from the word nafs for the self, and often for the Sufis, the nafs is the self that you have to battle to overcome. And so it's a bit of a loaded concept. You first have to witness the self, become conscious of your behavior, become conscious perhaps even of your bad behavior, and then also to then struggle past it. So struggle past your selfishness, struggle past your petty desires, your material wants. And this can also include the seeking and desire for irfan or encounter of God or encounter or mystical encounter. Um, and there's going to be one poem in which this concept is going to be played with in the film. In the movie itself, we're going to hear someone saying, "The people of the world are like three moths around a candle's flame. The first one went closer and said, 'I know about love.' The second one touched the flame lightly with its wings and says, 'I know how love's fire can burn.' And the third one threw himself into the heart of the flame and was consumed, and he alone knew what true love is." And we see this concept also showing up in the Tawasin of Mansur Halaj. He was the famous martyr of love who, when he was being killed, each part of his body screamed out "An al-Haq." This was one of the tales we told when we were discussing saints earlier this semester. And this is what Mansur Halaj has to say in this translation. So he says in the Ta'sin of understanding, first, the comprehensions of created natures are not attached to reality, and reality is not attached to created natures. Thoughts are adherences, and the adherences of created natures do not attach themselves to realities. The perception of reality is difficult to acquire. So, how much more difficult is the perception of the reality of the reality? So, the really real, i.e., God. Furthermore, Allah is beyond reality, and reality itself does not imply Allah. The moth flies about the flame until morning, and then he returns to his fellows and tells him that he experienced a spiritual state with the most eloquent expressions. He then mixes with the coquetry of the flame in desire to reach perfect union. The light of the flame is the knowledge of reality. Its heart is the reality of reality, and the union of it is the truth of reality. The moth was not satisfied with the light nor with its heat, so he leapt into the flame completely. Meanwhile, his fellows awaited his coming out so that he could tell them about his vision, since they had not been satisfied with hearsay. But at that moment, the moth was being utterly consumed, reduced and dispersed into fragments, and he remained without form or body or distinguishing mark. In what sense then can he return to his fellows? And in what state now has he obtained? He who has arrived at vision became able to dispense with reports. He who arrives at the object of his vision is no longer concerned with vision at all. This is Mansur Halaj, in this very kind of poetic and philosophical way, is describing the mystical encounter. This is Rumi's comment again, as we've mentioned in previous classes. I was raw, I became cooked, and now I am burned. In the state of being burned, I no longer can be an object of utility for other people, but the thing itself has been transformed. Its state has changed from one to another. This also, for mysticism, refers to the three states of being. So, yaqeen or understanding has three different forms. The first is ilm ul yaqeen. This occurs when someone's becomes certain that the sun exists when he sees the light and feels the heat. The second is ainul yaqeen. Is this occurs when a person becomes certain that the sun exists when he sees the sun itself. And the third is haq al yaqeen, the truth of understanding. When he sees this occurs when a person becomes certain that the sun exists, when the vision of his eye becomes immersed in the light of the sun. So this concept will come up in the form of a poem about the moths in the film, and so this is just something so you know when we encounter it that it's referring to these kind of Sufi approaches to three levels of understanding. In addition to the journey, you're going to see various expressions of love. And so, one form of love is adab or proper behavior. And that can include being courteous, being polite, cultivating a pleasant demeanor and gracious behavior. The belief is if you have adjusted and fixed the inside, then the outside will manifest that as well. And so it's very easy to say that someone who's rude, abusive, abrasive is not in a good state. I myself have met people who purport to be well adjusted Sufis, but one will often find that they are a bit of patriarchal in their behavior, at least towards their family members. It's difficult to take someone seriously who claims to be in a spiritual state who's screaming at their daughters for a cup of tea. Right. In addition, in the film, you're going to see love as a burning passion, love as surrender, love as awakening, and love as intimacy itself. And these are the kind of play of concepts of love that you're going to see emerging in the film. In addition, you're going to see citations and references to Rumi. For example, the film is going to open with the quote where it says, "There are many paths to Allah as there are souls on the earth." Or alternatively, the way that Rumi put it initially, "How many paths are there to God? There are as many paths as there are souls on earth." In addition, in the writing credits of the film, you're going to see a lot of characters that we've looked at this semester showing up, such as Rumi, Attar, Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Farid will show up, and also is Tonino Guerra, who we discussed a bit earlier. And on the image on right, you have the master Rumi consulting with one of his favorite students under the tree, and the rest of his kind of brotherhood is here as well. And if you remember, there was also something that we discussed in the last class about music and dance, about how what it takes is the right time, the right place, and the right companions, right? So the time is when the event is meant to take place. The second is where it takes place, ideally in the heart, in the qalb. And the last is who you do the Sufi ritual with, and that is with friends of God, the awliya, or the other people who have gathered with you, the ikhwan who have come to participate. In addition, you're going to see a number of chained stories connected in the film. This is the same way that the famous figure of Scheherazade saves her life. So she, as a storyteller, saves herself from being killed by her capricious husband by knitting one story into the other. And that's something that the film is going to play a great deal with, is how the stories chain one into the next, and how everyone's got a complete narrative of their own, but simultaneously is linked in this structure as well. And here at right, you have the story of a prince who's contemplating his soul. We suspect it may be Sultan Ibrahim ibn Adham of Balkh, who was visited by the angels in this painting in 1760s. But essentially, he is like Siddhartha Gautama, who sits under the Bodhi tree and contemplates his soul until he achieves enlightenment. And this figure is kind of a common figure in Sufism as well, which may be a borrowing or a loan figure from something like Buddhism, or maybe something organically that grows up in Islam from contact with Buddhist cultures, which include Afghanistan and Sindh, and those kind of regions would all have been Buddhist before Islam. In addition, what's kind of interesting about the story of the prince is this question of the prince is challenged at one point as to what his kingdom is worth. What is the place where you dwell worth? And he would say, oh, thousands of dirhams. It's a very expensive home. It's a very expensive palace that I live in. And then someone will say, well, what if you were dying of thirst in the desert? What would you give for a drink of water? And ultimately, this little reasoning experiment leads us to conclude to a dying prince who's dying in the desert of thirst. One drink, one cup of water would be worth his entire world. And this is an important kind of contemplative exercise which we can engage in. What is the real value of the things that we have in our lives, like the material goods, personal relationships? This is a metric and a lens to evaluate ourselves through. In addition, you're going to see the tale of separated lovers. This is something very popular again in Sufism. We discussed Layla and Majnun in earlier stories. Layla and Majnun fall in love. They don't consummate their love. Majnun falls so deeply in love that people think he's mad. Layla is not allowed to be married to him because she's not allowed to be married to a madman. She marries off somebody else. She dies of a broken heart. Majnun searches for her in the wilderness. He befriends animals. Eventually, he lays down on her grave and dies, or dies in the wilderness and is discovered. So, this idea of dying in love and unconsummated love is something very, very powerful in Sufism. You're going to see it showing up in the film as well. And just as a heads up, if you thought Eric Clapton's song Layla was connected to this, you would be right. That's where he got inspired from, was the story of Layla and Majnun, inspired his song Layla itself. Um, Next, we're going to have stories about the mantle. The mantle is going to show up in the film as well, the mantle or the stole. This is something extremely important as well, is the idea is that the Sufis received the mantle of the Prophet. The Prophet's cloak is referred to in a number of stories as having some magical powers. And also in this image here is Khidr, the green sage, sometimes also associated with Saint George or Gerges. And here in that image he's seen as the green one, and his mantle is claimed to have been inherited also by the Sufis. And so the passing of clothes and clothing is something pretty important as an act of joining a Sufi community or taking a Sufi master. Um, and Ibn Arabi, of course, who we discussed earlier this semester as well, says here, the Sheikh invested with me his khirqa, his cloak, in the very same place in his garden that Khidr had invested him, and in that same form of spiritual state that had come to him in it. And what you're going to see is different characters taking on this cloak in a chain of succession. So this is another important Sufi theme about the transference of Gnostic knowledge. In Buddhism, we have similar concepts as well. And I have mentioned this story before. In one story, Buddha lifts a flower up and Ananda smiles. And that is meant to be a Buddhist parable in the sense that Ananda has experienced mind to mind communication with the Buddha and understands perfectly from one indication alone. If you hear my son screaming in the background, my apologies. It's March break. I have done the best I could to calm them, but they're loud. They're very, very, very loud. It's been a tough few days. Anyway, on to the question of marriage. Marriage here. Was that someone commenting? You haven't heard them? Oh, good, good. I've tried my best to block them out. The cat was up here howling as well. He's now been stuck in the basement. We're just removing one obstacle after the other. So another thing that comes up in Sufism is this question of marriage, and this word marriage here also is urz, which is the celebration, annual celebration at the saint shrine in places like India, Iran, and others. It's a celebration of the life of the saint, but it also gives us a sense of what death entails. Is death something to be feared? Is death something to be rejoiced at when we receive it? And the idea for the saint is that the saint is returning to the arms of his beloved. And the idea is usually when you die in Islam, your deeds are recounted by angels that are going to be sitting on your shoulders. One will record your good deeds and one will record your bad deeds. And you will agonize over your actions in this life until the end of days when all truths will be revealed. And so you will suffer, in essence, the torments of the grave if you have lived a bad life. And not quite hell, but just this state of agony over whether or not you made it into heaven. And saints and martyrs and things don't face that. And Halaj, in fact, rejoices on his way to the gallows when they hit people stop him on the road. He says, "Oh, rejoice, for I'm on my way to the slaughterhouse." And so this sense of embracing death as a joyful transference from one form into another. In addition, you're going to see stories of unfaithful wives showing up in Rumi. In the case of the shoemaker and the unfaithful wife in the story on the right, the Sufi returns home and he finds his wife is in the arms of another man, and she narrates this really exquisite story where she invokes Quranic defenses and all of this to try and soak up the suspicions of her husband. And you can find this in the Masnavi. It's the beginning of book 4. And what she says here is there's a very profound statement in which Rumi says, if you desire that God be pleased with you, look at God with the eyes of those that love him. And that is just such a beautiful way of putting the relationship between the loved and the beloved. The idea that you look at them with eyes of those that love deeply. And this story is going to show up a little bit in our film as well. Lastly is this question of death. And in the Quran, Surah 42, 18, it says, those that believe not therein seek to hasten it, but those that believe go in fear of it, knowing that it is the truth. And Halaj, as I mentioned before, who's being hung in the image on the right, sees death as an opportunity to greet the beloved, and also the idea that he is martyred. He's a martyr of love, and the kinds of martyrs that are described in Islam, firstly, might be of war, or those who die in the pursuit of Islam or in the way of Allah. So, for example, if you're involved in a defensive war to protect a Muslim homeland against a non-Muslim aggressor, the argument was you would get heaven without the torment of the grave. In addition, you would be buried in the clothes that you were killed in. It's kind of important too. Um, and or the other way you can become a martyr in Islam is to die of an unfortunate circumstance, such as a plague, an abdominal disease, drowning, or falling building, childbirth, etc. Now, you may think that there's a big difference between fighting in a jihad and dying when a roof fell on your head. Perhaps intentionally, the Prophet made these two conceptions of martyrdom quite similar. However, scholars agonized to try and distinguish war martyrs as different from these other martyrs, because war martyr at least involves intentionality in acting, whereas having a building fall on your head doesn't require a whole lot of your own agency. In addition, these Sufis add an additional category of the love martyr, or a lover who dies in a state of love without having consummated their love. That's an example of Majnun, who never achieves his Layla. Another martyr of love, people cite Halaj, or also Jesus, or Isa, Hazrat Isa. Um, okay, we've reached the slide where I have indicated to myself, watch movie here. So if you are watching this as a recording, please note that I will be stopping the recording now. We will be watching the movie and then returning at its conclusion to have a discussion. So please grab your popcorn, grab a drink, get a bio break in if you need it, and let's get underway. Well, I hope you enjoyed that film. It's rapidly become one of my favorites. It's a very beautiful exploration of all of the themes that we've been discussing all semester, brought into a visual medium in this particular fashion. And um, I what I was hoping that to do with teaching this class around this film was to show you how much you've learned, perhaps if you've been with us all semester, because that film may have been incomprehensible to you at the start of the term. It may have been very frustrating to think all of these stories dropping in, dropping out, what makes sense and what doesn't. Whereas at this point in the semester, I hope you can glean some of which the director is inviting you to explore. Um, just as a last set of notes, on the structure of the tale itself, as you can see, it's meant to be kind of constructed as a chain narrative, which is non-linear. And if you know the story of Scheherazade, um, it's claimed that her husband would kill his wife on the dawn of the next day because he would tire of them, Shahryar. And Scheherazade, on the first night, begins to tell him a story. And then within the story is another story. And at the end of in the morning, when Shahryar asks her, how did the story end? She tells him that she's tired and she has to wait for the next day. And by so doing, she extends and lifts the warrant on her life, and is able to narrate this tale that stretches on into the apocryphal 1001 Nights. And she survives through these acts of storytelling. And so, in a certain way, the film works on this narrative as well, is that there's one narrative, right, of the prince and how he became this dervish, and then how he in turn leaves the world and leaves the next person in his place. But within each of these tales are these kind of sub stories of each of these characters trying to find their own path, using their own skills, their own talents, and their own abilities to reach this place, this great gathering, this mela of dervishes coming together to celebrate. And through each of those narratives, what the director is trying to highlight is Sufism is this sort of multiple paths. In the Bhagavad Gita, it said the paths to God are many, but God is one. And that's the kind of idea that's being played with in this film as well. Other things that you may see taking place in the film is the fact that it is drawing upon a very wide variety of cultures. So we see Sudanese dervishes, we see Algerians, we see Moroccans, we see Indians, Pakistanis, we see Iranis, all of these different cultures representing their kind of cultural form. And all traveling together on these roads that lead kind of nowhere. The other thing that's kind of fascinating about the film is the Arabic script. If you study it, uh, it flows across a page, almost like the movement of sand itself. And so when one studies a calligraphic piece or beautiful handwriting, it's like the study of the desert. It's like to look out into nature is to see the flowing of the letters. And so, somewhat deliberately, the director spends a lot of time showing us scenes of the desert where characters fade behind sand dunes and then reemerge in different places. And part of what he's showing us in these little plays is this idea also, philosophically, of how things, truths become veiled, hidden, and then the removing of veils is one of these activities that the characters in the film are engaging with as well. And in addition, the other thing that's kind of a possible read on the film is whether or not the granddaughter is related to Baba Aziz, or if she is even human, because she has the traits of the Hori as well, the kind of angelic visitors with dark hair and dark eyes. And so it's kind of a romantic way of thinking that she is his companion that is leading him to the place where he's going to leave his mortal form. And so they're traveling this last journey together. And you can see in the way that he interacts with her that he's fully conscious of everything that is happening to him and around him, and he's comfortable with it, whether it be adversity, whether it be something lovely and beautiful. And the ways that the dervishes greet each other and encounter each other is something that the director very deliberately is trying to show us, that Sufism is this path of compassion and love and beauty, and that in seeing fellow travelers on that route, as opposed to disdaining them, saying that my cultural form is superior, instead it is a mutual encounter and celebration of the other. And so that's what's at play in this film. I invite any comments or any questions, if there are some at this stage. And then we will end the public portion of the lecture and switch to our discussions with the students. Any comments, questions, thoughts on the seeing that film? In the sub, it said tete-a-tete. Literally, yeah, the putting together of heads, right? Um, yeah, yeah, that's it. Um, so one thing to keep in mind in terms of the French is the director himself is from Tunisia, but also lives in France. So that might be some reason why that kind of snuck in. Um, so the soundtrack of the film as well is a celebration of all of the music and poetry in the different kind of Persianate and Arabic languages, and you'll find the communication for these different mystics is very easy. That one speaks Arabic and the other understands it, despite the fact that they may not speak the language. They speak Urdu, Farsi, Maghrebi Arabic, Arabic from different regions, and it's really it's the sense that they can understand each other despite the language. It's meant to be very much like a dream, Margaret. You're right to say that. Um, and for Sufis as well, the idea of the dream as being a place of revelation was something that the tradition was quite comfortable with, at least until the modern period. Absolutely. The other thing that to speak to the music, for those of you who found that interesting, there are a few different films that kind of play with these same ideas. Tony, let me just make sure I get his name right. Um, yeah, let me just pull up his name right here. Tony Gatliff. I'll type that in here. Tony Gatliff has done a number of projects about the music of these different cultures. So, what you may not know is that Sanskrit and Gaelic are kind of related in terms of languages, and the reason that they may have some connections is that the nomadic cultures that flow from places like Rajasthan go all the way up into Ireland, and these routes and paths would trade music, instruments, songs. And Tony Gatliff did this beautiful film. I believe he won an Academy Award for it too. Uh, it's called Lacho Drom, and it is just exquisite. It is the kind of story of these. I'm going to use the term gypsy because he uses it in the documentary. These Roma or gypsy cultures that flow from Rajasthan, and in his exploration, he goes to each of these communities and encounters their musical styles and how it flows into the next one. And it's a movie without explanation. He's just showing us the cultures. He's not got like an Attenborough narrator explaining everything to you, but I cannot recommend that film enough. And you can see also, perhaps there might have been influence in this film because the first kind of singers that we see are Rajasthani singers. When the prince is in his seclusion, and the Rajasthani singers are again a nomadic tribe, known especially for being snake charmers and extracting the venom from snakes. And so it's compelling that he begins the story with encountering the people who charm snakes, when that's the crime for which Adam and Eve are cast out from the Garden of Eden, is for listening to a snake, right? And so the snake charmer is the one who begins his exploration of that journey for him. So I found that very interesting in the film as well. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. We are nearing the end of the semester. We've just got one or two classes left with regards to our lectures. But please let that not be the end of our journey of learning together. All of my students know, and also I extend this to members of the public, if this material is compelling and interesting, this is the stuff that I live and breathe. And so if you want to talk to me about it or engage with me about it, or hang out sometime when there's no risk of contagion, let's try and make that happen. So thank you again for your time and your energy, and for joining us today. And I hope that this film was a good interruption to our overly fast, overly complicated lives. It allowed us to sort of flow together for a little while. And again, for those of us who weren't able to watch it today on Al Qamiyya, if you want to check it out on YouTube, it is chopped up in 6 parts with English subtitles, or alternatively without them online too. All right, wonderful. So this is where I am going to stop the recording.